Hello, everyone. I'm Jason, Secretary for the Hunt Club Community Association, HCCA. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for being here tonight. We have a great presentation coming. Before we get to the presentation quickly, I just want to let you know the Zoom chat has been disabled, but if you do have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. Recording is going to be available if you want to review it again, and emailed to everyone tomorrow about the same time. And now I'm just going to turn it over to Piero. He's one of our local Butterflyway rangers in our community.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome, everyone. My name is Piero Narducci. I am a member of the Hunt Club Community Association. I was a former board member, and now I'm a proud, as Jason mentioned, Butterflyway ranger. The Butterflyway Ranger program is a program from the David Suzuki Foundation, and the objective is to grow pollinator gardens or gardens that are pollinator friendly to increase the number of bees and butterflies in our communities and across the country. Now there are 900 rangers across Canada for this year's edition of the Butterflyway Ranger program. There are about 50 Butterflyway Rangers in Ottawa, according to the Facebook group. And I believe there are at least 3 Butterflyway Rangers in our Hunt Club community area, and probably a bit more with the Riverside Park group. And the number of recruits are growing. I know there's some of you out there, both recruits and Butterflyway Rangers, joining us tonight, so thank you very much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. Aussi, je veux mentionner que la présentation sera la plupart de la présentation sera en anglais. Si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas de les soulever, de les poser. Je vais traduire pour Barrett et puis je vais essayer de traduire la réponse pour vous autres. Mais je pense que la plupart de nous sont en anglais et la présentation sera présentée, comme je mentionnais, en anglais. So I'm very pleased to introduce Barrett Ericsson. She's an avid gardener and has been for 20 years, an enthusiastic pollinator gardener for the past 4 years, and has turned her Ottawa corner garden into a thriving pollinator garden for all to see. I believe she offers tours of that wonderful little corner. She has generously offered to share her knowledge with us tonight. I'm sure it's going to help us in our first steps to creating a more pollinator-friendly community. And so without further ado, I turn it over to you, Barrett.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen here. Before I get started, I just want to mention a few more things about me and the presentation. I am an amateur gardener. I have no particular expertise in ecology or entomology or horticulture or design. I have read a lot and learned through experience, and I'm going to share that information with you to the best of my abilities. And the next point is that the photos in this presentation, most of them were taken by me in my garden, unless I note otherwise in the captions. And I use common names for plants, insects, and birds. These are the main points that I want to get across this evening. This is actually very easy to do. I'm going to share a lot of information with you, things that you should do, you could do, that you should not do. Don't get bogged down by all the information. Don't try to make the garden perfect from the beginning. You don't need to. Just get started, even if it's starting very small. Just get started and you can improve your garden over time. You'll want to be providing food, water, habitat in your garden for pollinators. And I will show you how to do that. And I'll also talk about how to create your garden, how to plan it and choose plants and location. Including native plants is the most important element. There's a saying, plant it and they will come. And the it in that saying is native plants. A guideline is to include 70% native plants The David Suzuki Foundation, they recommend 50%, but include as many as you can. You can also always add more later. That's what I did. I was starting with an existing garden that had very few native plants, and I just kept adding gradually in my yard. And I've tried to indicate non-native plants, plants that are not native to the Ottawa area that I know of, with an asterisk. Now, the pollinators. When we think of pollinators, usually we think of European honeybees, but there are actually many other kinds of pollinators and many other kinds of bees. In Ontario, we have over 400 kinds. I was astonished to discover this. This poster is from the Pollinator Partnership in the United States, showing bee diversity there, but you can get an idea of the diversity of bees that exist here as well. They vary in size. Some are smooth, some are furry. They have different lengths of tongues, so they can pollinate in different ways. And some other pollinators include butterflies, moths, beetles, flower flies, sometimes called hoverflies, wasps. There are many kinds of non-threatening solitary wasps, and even hummingbirds. And these are some of the interesting pollinators I've seen in my garden. So why create a pollinator garden? Well, they're like canaries in a coal mine, unfortunately. We can see from studies that the numbers of insects are declining dramatically. And if you take monarch butterflies as an example, they have been declining for decades, and they are continuing to decline despite recent efforts to help them. So we need to do more. Insect populations in general are also declining. So you might think that for the most part, that sounds great because that means fewer black flies and mosquitoes. But the entomologist E.O. Wilson has said that insects are the little things that run the world. So if there's a decline in insects, it will have an impact for us as well. I was surprised to learn that with all the nature we have here in Canada, that there are even problems with insect numbers and declining pollinator numbers here in Ontario. There are a few pollinators that don't even exist in Ontario anymore, including the rusty patch bumblebee, which you might have heard of. It was added to the endangered species list in the United States. So pollinators are important because obviously they pollinate a lot of our food, and they pollinate native plant, wild plants. They're also the foundation of many food chains. So many other creatures eat insects, including baby birds. Chickadees actually chickadee parents need to find thousands of caterpillars to feed one nest of chickadees, and they're small birds. And they also have other roles in controlling pests and decomposing materials. So what has caused this decline in insect numbers, and what can we do about it? Well, pesticides are an obvious problem. So we should avoid using them in our yards and try to buy organic produce if it's possible. Climate change is a factor. Many of the effects of it are unknown, but one example how it relates to pollinators, scientists have found that the protein content in pollen is actually declining with warming temperatures. And pests and diseases from managed bees are harming wild pollinators. Diseases from honeybees, and I was surprised to learn that bumblebees are actually kept in greenhouses to pollinate plants like tomatoes. So if they have a disease and they escape, then they can spread this disease to wild populations of pollinators by visiting the same plants. Many people think that keeping bees, about having a backyard beehive will help pollinators, but They're actually considered the chickens of the bee world. If we wanted to help songbirds, keeping backyard chickens would not help the songbirds. And it's the same idea for pollinators. If we want to help wild pollinators, keeping honeybees isn't going to help. They're obviously important for agriculture, but it's not very useful for us to keep them in our backyards. And habitat loss and fragmentation is another serious problem. And this is where we come in. We can create new habitat in our yards. The Pollinator Victory Garden is a book at the Ottawa Public Library, and I like the title. The Victory Gardens were used during the World Wars. People planted vegetables in their yards, and so many people did it that it did have an impact, a significant impact. So if many people plant pollinator victory gardens in their yards, they will add up to have an impact. And the David Suzuki Foundation's Butterflyway project, by encouraging communities to plant a dozen gardens close together, that helps create a corridor so pollinators have a lot of food in one area, and they will connect as more people do it throughout urban areas. So this was why I wanted to start a pollinator garden. We lost a cedar tree in our front yard, so I had a spot where the lawn wasn't doing very well, so I wanted to do something else there. I didn't really expect it would be that successful because we're near Carling Avenue. There's a school behind us with a huge lawn. There isn't that much nature right around us. But I was pleasantly surprised that the garden was actually an immediate success with pollinators and my neighbors. Right away, we had butterfly laying eggs on host plants that I planted for it, and we had many bumblebees. By September of 2017, only a few months after the garden was planted, it was very full. I had planted some annuals as well to help fill it in while my other plants were still small. And this annual, called Mexican Tithonia, attracted dozens of monarchs, migrating monarchs and painted ladies. That first year in the garden, I had never seen anything like it before. And the following year, as my other plants, my native plants, became more established and larger, I didn't use as many annuals, and we were actually seeing an increase in insect diversity and numbers. We see an increase every year, actually. So how did I create this successful pollinator garden, and how can you? Well, by providing flowers that offer nectar and pollen for pollinators. Butterflies don't use the pollen, but bees do, and some other insects. The bees gather pollen to feed their larvae and to develop their eggs. You should try to provide continuous flowers from spring to fall, and plant in groups of at least 3 plants, so there's lots of food in one spot, and it's easy for pollinators to see your garden. And also try to include a variety of flower shapes and sizes and colors. This is a picture of what I call my mini meadow, where I converted an existing garden area and expanded it, adding many different native plants. It is a bit wild looking. I think it's very pretty. So you'll also want to provide host plants for caterpillars. And I emphasize the word native here, including native plants. So native plants are, the usual definition is that they're plants that were here before colonization. So plants that have been here for a long time. And the plants that have been brought to North America from other places are usually called introduced plants or non-native plants. So butterflies will only lay their eggs on specific plants that their caterpillars can eat. We gathered an egg from some milkweed and raised this butterfly indoors so we could see its different life stages. These are some kinds of milkweed that I have in my garden. For small urban gardens, swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed are better choices. Common milkweed can spread a bit too much for smaller gardens. So monarch caterpillars can only eat the milkweed. If we don't have milkweed, we don't have the monarchs. And that's part of the problem we're in now. So why do butterflies and other insects need the native plants? Well, over time, they have co-evolved. Douglas Tallamy is an entomologist who's written a few very good books, and he explains that plants don't want to be eaten. They have chemical defenses, and these chemicals make them taste bad or make them toxic to insects or other things that want to eat the plants. But over time, the insects need to eat. So over time, they adapt to be able to eat and digest these chemicals. Instead of trying to adapt to all the plants and all the different chemicals, insects have been able to specialize in adapting to specific plants. And these plants are called our host plants. So with introduced non-native plants, because they haven't been here for very long compared to the native plants, the insects haven't had time to adapt and be able to eat them. So we need the native plants to feed the butterfly, caterpillars, and other insects. And I was surprised to see that there are other insects that use milkweed as their host plant that specialize in this plant, eating this plant. So I found red milkweed beetles and swamp milkweed bugs, small milkweed bugs, as well as tussock moths. And I was interested to find out that birds will even use the fibers inside the stems of milkweed to build their nests. So they've all adapted to use this plant. And there are even bees that are specialists that have host plants. They collect pollen from one kind of plant. I don't know if I've actually had specialist bees in my garden, so these are a few pictures of ones that you might find in your garden. So a few other butterflies that I frequently see in my garden, they seem easy to attract, are American lady butterflies, and they use pearly everlasting and field pussy toes or other varieties of pussy toes. And black swallowtail butterflies, and I've also been seeing giant swallowtail butterflies. The black swallowtail butterflies will eat dill, parsley, and fennel, and one of their native host plants, the Latin name is Zizia. So you might be wondering, well, why can this butterfly eat these non-native plants, the dill, the parsley, and the fennel? Well, their chemical defenses, the chemicals in the plants, are similar enough to the native host plants that they can eat them. But often this is not the case with the non-native plants. And we've also been seeing a lot of fritillary butterflies. They use violets as a host plant. And I was given these violets from my neighbor before they resodded their lawn, and I've let them spread underneath my hedgerow. you want to find out what other kinds of butterflies you might see in your garden and what their house plants are, if you want to include them, the Fletcher Wildlife Garden website has a good list. It's called Gardening for Butterflies, the page. And Douglas Talmy also has a list. This was on his website. It's no longer on it, but something similar is in his books. These, particularly trees, native trees, are like super host plants. They host so many different kinds of butterflies and moths. And since many of us have native plants like maple trees and oak trees, pine, spruce, whatever, in our yards, it means that you probably have a head start on your pollinator garden without realizing it. And on the right-hand side, there's a list of some of the perennial plants that you might already be planning to include in your garden because they provide pollen and nectar, but they are also host plants for some butterflies and moths. So one thing to keep in mind when you see butterflies and caterpillars in your garden, not many of them actually make it to adulthood. Female butterflies lay hundreds of eggs, and part of the reason is because caterpillars are food for so many different creatures. And if you want to end up with more adult butterflies in your garden, then you can collect the eggs and raise them in a mesh tent, a mesh container, and to protect them from predators. And I think this is a particularly good idea with monarchs because they are a vulnerable species. Their numbers are declining, whereas some of the other kinds of butterflies that I mentioned are not in danger, but monarchs could use a little extra help. This insect on the slide actually is a parasitoid insect that laid its egg in a black swallowtail caterpillar. So if you bring the caterpillars in and not the eggs, then you risk bringing a parasitoid wasp into your enclosure. And European wasps are also a predator of the caterpillars, and you can discourage them by hanging a false paper wasp nest in your yard. They're territorial, so then they hopefully won't make a nest in your yard. Might allow a few more caterpillars make it to adulthood. So what plants are native to Ontario and to Ottawa more specifically? Well, the Wild Pollinator Partners has a great blog post on their website with some resources where you can find out which plants are actually native. I've tried to indicate which ones that I know are not native, but there may be some others that I'm not aware of that I've included that are not locally native to Ottawa. I've tried to indicate as many as I am aware of. So you should also include water in your garden. I have a plant called cup plant in my garden, and the stems where they connect to the leaves, it forms a little cup, and it will hold water or dew, so birds or insects can drink it. I've also seen people making butterfly puddling dishes. Butterflies will drink water from sand or from soil. I haven't made one of these myself. I thought it looked difficult to clean, but that's another option. On the Canadian Wildlife Federation blog, you can find instructions. So we talked about the food that you should provide, the flowers and host plants. Now, to create a habitat, a safe, suitable environment for pollinators, that's what I'll be covering now. So to provide nest sites, Solitary, most native bees are solitary. This illustration shows their life cycle, unlike honeybees that have a hive that continues throughout the winter and into the next year. Solitary bees will lay their eggs and they develop and remain in their nest throughout the winter, and then they will emerge the following year. So you've probably seen bee houses in stores. This is one that I bought. I liked the clear side that it allowed you to see into the nest. You can see at the top, it was actually a tiny wasp that made this nest, and it laid its eggs in with small spiders and caterpillars. And then it would build a wall. Then it would put a few more spiders and caterpillars and lay an egg. It's almost as though it has made little bedrooms for each of its larvae. And it has used mud. So that's one reason why you should include water in the garden, so it can, if there isn't mud there, it can make the mud. The bottom illustration shows a small bee nest, and you can tell it's a bee and not a wasp because of the yellow color as the pollen, and the white things are the larvae. And you can also see the little dots that are they're insects that are stuck underneath the plastic. And this illustrates why bee houses aren't necessarily a great thing to include unless you clean them or change the components every year. Any pest, any insect that could be harming the larvae can easily spread from one nest to another because there are so many nests so close together, or diseases or predators can easily prey upon many nests at once. If you do want to have a bee nest in your yard, there are great instructions on the Fletcher, the Ottawa Field Naturalists website. We made this nest using a cream carton and paper tubes. We put it out too late in the year, so we didn't see any mason bees nesting in it, but we're hopeful for this year. So in nature, obviously there aren't bee houses. So in nature, bees will use stems or holes, tunnels made in trees made by beetles. And you can see here the illustration of the stems that were cut to about 15 inches. This is an illustration from Heather Holmes' website. She's an author about native pollinators and plants. And on the right, you can see where a small carpenter bee used my ironweed stems when I had cut them off, like she advised. This bee had dug out the stems to lay its eggs. And this is another kind of cavity nesting bee that we see in our yard each year now. It's a leafcutter bee. And instead of using mud between the little rooms in it for its larvae, it uses leaves. It lines its nest with these leaves and uses the leaves as partitions. So its nest, if you see one, it looks like almost like a green cigar. And these are some of the leaves where the leafcutter bee had cut pieces. And I had to look hard to find these. I had been watching the bee. They don't completely make your plant look like Swiss cheese. It's not really that obvious. So actually, 70% of native bees nest in the ground. I was very surprised to learn about this. Even though I've been gardening for 20 years, I've never noticed a bee nesting in my garden, perhaps because I didn't have the appropriate plants for them. But if you leave some areas of bare ground, it doesn't need to be large areas, leave some areas free of mulch and obviously landscape fabric. and plants, then the bees can use these areas to make their nests. And I've read that they're more likely to use areas that are south facing and sloped so that it will be warm, so that it can help the larvae develop early. This is a mining bee nest from our yard. I actually watched this bee digging it out. You can see in the top picture, the bee is peeking out. And then on the right, here are the same kind of bees visiting pussy willow flowers. And the other interesting nest that we saw in our yard was of a bicolored green sweat bees. And these bees are considered semi-social. Each female makes her own nest tunnels in the ground, but they share the entrance holes, partly because then they can share the guarding duties. Because if you look on the leaf on the lower part of the photograph, there's a little red bee, and that is actually the third kind of solitary bee. They're the cavity nesting bees, the ground nesting bees, and this is a cuckoo, some kind of cuckoo bee. It wants to go into this nest and lay its eggs in the nest. It doesn't actually collect pollen itself for its larvae. It lays its eggs in another nest where a bee had already gathered the pollen for its larvae. And bumblebees, they have a completely different kind of nesting behavior. They are social like the honeybees, and it's actually tricky to find a bumblebee nest and tricky to encourage them into your yard. We did see a couple of years ago a queen bumblebee starting a nest under our shed, but it didn't seem successful. After a while, we just stopped seeing any bees going in and out of the nest. And it had been a groundhog den and later a mouse nest. And apparently bumblebees like to use old mouse nests because there's insulation material in there to help keep their larvae warm, especially in the cool spring. And I talked a lot about the female bees, but what about the male bees? Well, they don't live in a nest, the male solitary bees. They actually hang out in the garden. And we've watched these male bees, these bicolored green sweat bees, sleeping under this one coneflower every night for a few weeks. It was quite interesting to see. In the morning when the sun would warm up the flower, they would come out from under the flower and sunbathe. So the other way you can create habitat for pollinators in your garden, besides creating the nest sites, is by changing your maintenance practices. Many conventional garden maintenance practices are actually harmful to pollinators and habitat. Pesticides and other chemicals like fungicides and herbicides can damage bees, even if they pollinators, even if they don't kill them outright. They may have sublethal effects, or the combination of them can have other damaging effects. If you don't use chemicals to kill pest insects, well, then what are you going to do? You'll start to see predatory and parasitoid insects in the garden. They will eventually, there'll be enough of them to do the work for you. Pollinator habitat is the same kind of habitat as these beneficial insects use. So ladybugs are probably the most familiar example of these insects. And these are some of the life stages of some ladybugs that were on a swamp milkweed plant that had some aphids on it. So you just have to not panic when you see these pest insects. Just wait a little while, and you should start to see some of these beneficial insects appearing to control the situation. You should also leave your leaves in the fall and throughout the winter and early into the spring. So when you're cleaning up your yard in the spring, wait until it's consistently 10 degrees Celsius approximately. During the day, the insects will, with the warmth, they will start to emerge and complete developing and emerge. So this morning cloak butterfly, they actually overwinter as an adult butterfly under leaves or under bark. So they're one of the first butterflies that you'll see. And if you clean up those leaves, then you risk getting rid of these butterflies. And the same goes with butterflies that overwinter as a chrysalis. So this giant swallowtail chrysalis was on a pot of rue, common rue, that I grew for them. And if I had this in my garden and cut all these stems back, put them into leaf bags, then I would be getting rid of this chrysalis as well. So you can also use in addition to the leaves, you can use other materials as mulch. They will break down. If the stems and other debris, you chop it up and just leave it on the ground, or you can put it into a compost pile or brush pile. But there's no need really to get rid of it, to put it into bags at the curb. Since we've had droughts for several years now, or near droughts, I wanted to mention a few things about watering. So if you plant the right plant in the right place, you reduce the need for watering. And I like to put little rings of mulch around new plants so that if I water them with a watering can or a sprayer, then the water stays at that plant instead of just running off. And you can use soaker hoses. I have a few, but I'm trying to limit the use of them because of the plastic. I cut the ends off of wire coat hangers to use as pins. And that's a good way of watering because it keeps the water at the soil level. You're not getting all over the leaves where it's just going to evaporate and quickly, and it's a bit of a waste. If you do use a sprinkler, then use it from dusk till dawn in that space of time, because bees return to the nest for the evening, for the night. And if you're using the sprinkler during the day, then you risk destroying the nest entrance and the bee can't find its ground nest again. And I mentioned already about using leaves as mulch, but if you do want to use mulch, then choose a fine mulch, like composted mulch. I use composted pine mulch. That's my favorite. And while there are a lot of things you no longer need to do in a pollinator garden, you will have to do a little bit of work and a bit of weeding and editing, I call removing any seedlings that you don't want. You can just give them away if you have seedlings from the plants that you've put in your garden. So this book, The No Maintenance Perennial Garden, it's at the Ottawa Public Library, and it has a schedule as well as some other tips on controlling weeds. If you weed often at the beginning, then you can eliminate the weeds, and any seeds that are near the surface will have sprouted, and you're getting rid of all of them. If you limit the soil disturbance, then you're not bringing more weed seeds up to the surface. And also, if you plant densely, you plant in layers with a ground cover or lower filler plants in between your taller ones, it blocks the light from reaching any weed seeds that remain. And I found this quite effective. I don't have to I don't have to weed very much in the garden. I actually end up weeding the paths most of the time, which is quite annoying. So when you're not doing the typical garden maintenance, and if you're concerned what your neighbors might think, they might be concerned that they think you're neglecting your yard, you can put up a sign or make sure the edges are tidy or put labels on the plants, things to indicate that you're doing this for a reason. So the next part that I'm going to talk about is how to create the garden. So now you know what you need to have in the garden. How do you actually create the garden? So you want to, I mentioned before, you want to use as many native plants as you can. And the easiest way to do that is growing them from seed. It's best to do it in the winter because most native plants, many native plants, seeds need a period of cold in order to germinate. So now, because it's spring, there are fewer seeds that you can choose from if you want to grow them from seed. So this is how I usually grow them. I put seeds in pots of soil out in the snow. But you still can use seeds now by tricking them into thinking they've gone through winter by putting them in the fridge. So if you put the seeds in baggies with a moistened medium such as vermiculite or sand for a period of time, then you plant them. After that in soil, then they will germinate as though they had gone through winter weather. So different seeds need different periods of time in this cold treatment. So I'll back up. The Prairie Moon Nursery website is in the US, but many of the plants are the same here or similar. So you can find their germination information there, but it's really not that complicated. This is a list of seeds from their website that only requires 30 days of cold treatment. So you could still, if you can get a hold of these kinds of seeds, you can still put them in the fridge and be able to plant them in May, or before that, but for the spring. And there are even some that only require 10 days. And then there's another group of native plant seeds that don't require any cold treatment. So you can plant these just in the spring as you would annuals or some vegetable seeds. From a few packs of seeds, you can have so many plants this way to share with other people or just to really fill in your space. It's very economical. So a few tips for caring for your seeds and your plants. So make sure you label the pots and the plants when they're in the ground so you know what you've got. And if you've planted them outside in the snow like I do, then just make sure they're watered in the spring. And once they sprout, make sure they're moist if we don't get rain. And if many seeds germinate in one pot, you can, and I just pull them apart and put them into new pots. And plant them in the ground as soon as you can, maybe when they're 3 inches tall or so. It's a lot of work watering pots. They dry out quickly. So the sooner you get them in the ground, the better. You can let Mother Nature do the work. That's one reason I like planting the seeds outside in the snow, because then I don't have to worry about how much time the seeds need in the cold before they'll germinate. I just let Mother Nature do it, just as she usually does. And you can also include annuals like I did. They help fill in around the native plants. native plants can be a bit slow to start. That's because they're establishing their root systems. So there's a saying that they sleep, creep, and leap. The first year they sleep, so they look like they're not doing very much, but they're growing their root systems. The second year they're growing a bit more vigorously, and then the third year they really take off. And these are a few of the annuals that I particularly like for butterflies and bees that I continue to grow in my garden. So when you're buying annuals, just try to buy untreated seeds. These are a few places where I've bought seeds before, and I've been very happy with them. So maybe you're not interested in growing from seed. It seems daunting, although it shouldn't. It is very easy to do. I had not grown anything from seed before I started growing native plants. And again, if I can do it, you can do it. This is the Fletcher Wildlife Garden native plant sale is one of the best places to buy native plants here in Ottawa. It happens every year, the first Saturday in June. It was canceled last year, but this year it's expected to go ahead somewhat differently, online purchasing with scheduled pickup times for the plants. And these are some other places where I buy native plants, and I've been very happy with them. When you're buying native plants from a nursery, it's quite likely that they've grown them in a greenhouse or a hoop house. So their plants have had a head start. So they would have treated the seeds in the fridge early on, planted them earlier than the spring in the greenhouse, and the warmth of the greenhouse gave them a head start. So you'll be able to buy a larger plant than if you were growing it the way I do. And a few words of caution if you're buying pollinator plants from chain stores, grocery stores. Friends of the Earth tested some plants that they bought in Ottawa stores and found traces of pesticides. This was a few years ago, but you just never quite know. You can ask, and perhaps that they will be keeping track of these things now. You can ask how the plants are raised in the greenhouses if they know if they've been treated with pesticides. And also be wary of cultivars. This is a white coneflower in my garden, and it just is not as appealing to pollinators as the straight species pink or purple, it's called purple coneflower, that I have in my backyard. It's a dramatic difference. And I included this because a lot of people are starting their gardens this year from scratch. And I've never had a big gardening budget. So I've created my garden incrementally, a little bit at a time. But if you want to do a lot all at once, like I said, you can grow from seed. But these are some other ways that you can try to create your gardens on a budget. If you're adapting an existing garden, like I was in my backyard, these are a few of the questions that you can ask about the plants that you already have. First of all, remove invasive plants. Invasive plants are fast-spreading, introduced plants that once they reach natural spaces, they grow out of control and crowd out the native plants. And the second question you can ask is if the plants you have are benefiting wildlife or pollinators, or if they're just pretty like a plastic plant. And because I am striving to include 70% of native plants, the 30%, I have some, these plastic plants that don't really have much value to pollinators, but some of them I just really like. Some peonies or daylilies, hostas, things like that. If you want to find out which plants are invasive, you can go to the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and they also have a booklet on substitutes for invasive plants. Some examples of invasive plants that you might even see in garden centers still, unfortunately, are Japanese barberry, miscanthus, Japanese honeysuckle, porcelain berry. Those are some that I had that I can think of that I removed. Oh, and I spent a couple of days ripping out periwinkle from an area of my backyard. It's a continual battle. So when you're planning your pollinator garden, here are a few tips. So when you're choosing a location, if you have some options, choose a spot that is as sunny as possible and sheltered from the wind for butterflies. But if you do have shade, it's not impossible. You will end up including more plants for the spring that bloom before the leaves come out. And again, the trees themselves, if they're native, are beneficial to pollinators. And there are also some great goldenrods and asters for the fall that grow well in part shade. So there won't be as many plants that are blooming in the summer, but if you can include those summer blooming plants in the more sunny spots in your yard or the edges. And if you can place your garden where you can see it from indoors, then you can enjoy the wildlife even when it's too hot or cold out. And if you have an existing seating area, you can place your garden near that so you can watch the activity. Assess your location, take some pictures, measure it, consider how the garden will be viewed. If there's a wall behind it, what color is the wall, so that maybe you want the flowers to contrast the color. If it's an island bed, you might want to put the taller plants in the center and then the shorter plants around the outside. If you have or making a large garden, plan to make a narrow path so it's easier for viewing and watering. And you don't have to play twister when you're trying to walk around the plants. And determine the conditions of your garden, how much light it gets, what the soil is like, what the moisture level is like. Then that will help you in choosing plants. And to prepare the site, the easiest way to do it is to cover it with layers of newspaper or cardboard and mulch, but then you have to leave it for a year. So if you're impatient and you want to get started this year, if it's an area of lawn where you're going to create a garden, then you will just have to dig up the sod. So aim to have one plant per square foot when you're planning how many plants to include in your garden. And if you're going to include plants from spring to fall that are continuously blooming, including three plants for spring, 3 for summer, 3 for fall is a good guideline. And so that's 9 plants. And then having at least 3 of each means that you should be budgeting for a minimum of 27 plants. But again, if your budget is tight or you don't want to dig up that much sod, do what you can, even if it's just 1 plant for each season. Just get started and you can continue to work on it next year. And this is sort of how I narrow down the plant choices. I find there are many lists of native plants, pollinator plants, and when you don't know much about the plants, it can seem overwhelming. So how do you narrow down from a long list? So these are some of the ways that I do it. finding a color scheme or considering the height of the plant, whatever other factors you need to consider in your garden. So here are a few of these lists of pollinator plants from the Xerces Society. They have ones for different regions, and we are in the Great Lakes region for their list. And for some smaller lists from Heather Holm, the author that I mentioned earlier, she has these very pretty posters of plants for different soil conditions. And most of these plants are native to here. And these are a couple of Heather Holm's books. The Bees book is at the library, the Ottawa Public Library, but I don't think the Pollinators one is. And honestly, they're my first place to look when I'm trying to choose plants. They're beautiful books and very informative. I've been asked before to give top 5 or 10 plants to choose for a new pollinator garden, and I don't think I could do a top 5. That's too hard. So I've made a top 10, and I've cheated a little bit by including types of plants. So depending on whether you have sun or shade or what height you want the plants to be or whatever, there are options. So aim to include these different types, or as many of these different types as you can. And to look for pictures of the gardens that you like for inspiration. And one of my favorite garden designers is Ben O'Brien from Wildlife Design in Picton. And his gardens are just beautiful, and you can get ideas of what you might want to include in your garden. And it's a naturalistic style, which I really like. But you can use native plants in other garden styles, cottage gardens, formal ones as well. So here are just a few examples. I made some garden plans in case you want to, you need some help to get your garden going. You're not sure what to do. So I helped put in a butterfly garden at my son's school, and it was also immediately successful with pollinators. So the first year we had black swallowtail caterpillars and monarch caterpillars. So we were thrilled. And this is the inspiration, the picture that helped me choose the colors and the plants, or similar plants, for that garden. I thought it was very colorful and the kids would enjoy it. And so here are some pictures from last year, from right before school started. And even though we had a drought and no one could go and visit the garden to maintain it over the spring and summer, the garden looked fantastic. So it really proves that this is easy. I had done a small amount of weeding, but really not very much. I was surprised how little it needed. And even some of the annuals had self-seeded, so because we hadn't been there to plant them, they planted themselves, which was great. So on these little plans, each square represents a square foot. And I've included mini plans just to show which plants would be blooming in each season. So this is a large garden. It's an odd shape, so I didn't include that garden's plan, but this is based on the plants that are in it. And this is a legend of the plants and how many are included in that plan. And I have included similar kinds of plants in my backyard mini meadow, but I have been adding grasses to it, little blue stem and muhly grass. And I think it's just beautiful, but some people might consider this a bit messy looking because of the grasses, but the school garden is a more conventional looking garden with the tall plants at the back, the shorter plants at the front, the bright color scheme. And this next plan is for the front pollinator garden extension. I don't know if you remember, but the pictures from the garden in the first year, there was still an area of grass. So I've removed it and I'm including pollinator plants there. And near the edge where the sidewalk is, I'm just using ground covers so that it's not tall. It doesn't hopefully bother anyone. The inspiration for that garden was some gardens by Nigel Dunnett from the UK. And this is, so I substituted the plants, but I kept that color scheme and the idea of it being low. So this garden extension is only about 2.5 feet tall, which I think makes it look less messy and hopefully more acceptable to people. Every year you hear stories on the news about people who have a wild garden in their front yard and they run into trouble with municipal bylaw officers and neighbors. So I'm trying to find a middle ground between planting native plants for pollinators and keeping my neighbors happy too. And because we're on a corner, the plants need to be low because I can't obstruct the view for traffic or pedestrians. And this is a picture from September. And this narrow garden plan, I'm imagining that it could be along a driveway. So if you're not interested in planting at the sidewalk, you can still use low plants along your driveway to have a similar effect. And this is a legend for the plants that I've included in that plan. And for other colors of plants, if you wanted to do something similar, but maybe you don't like orange or yellow, some other colors, this was my short list for plants to include in the front. And I've shared it with a few other people, indicating which plants are not native to Ottawa. I called them Prairie Plants. Usually they're Prairie Plants. And where I got the seeds of the plants from. And I mentioned a bit already about that you still can have a pollinator garden in a shady yard. Some tips for that include mimicking the layers of the woodland. So having under the canopy trees, having smaller trees and understory shrubs, and then ground covers and flowering plants below. These are the kinds of plants that would naturally grow in woodland edges and clearings. And I found one of the best places to buy these kinds of plants is Connaught Nursery in Cobden. And this is the most important place where you should include the leaves because this is what it would be like in nature. And this is a list of some of the pollinator plants that I've included. I have a lot of dry shade. Where it's shady, it's quite dry. So there are even asters and goldenrods that you can include. There are a lot of options. And my garden is also more than just a pollinator garden. I've been surprised by this. I was not expecting for the pollinator garden to be so fascinating, to see so many interesting insects and birds. So birds will come and eat the seeds on the plants. And some of the insects on the plants as well, but I don't see that as much. It's usually birds eating the seeds. And if you leave the stems like I mentioned before, if you leave the stems in the fall and winter, along with the leaves, then birds can eat the seeds during the winter. And some of the plants that the trees and shrubs that I planted for pollinators in the fall or late summer, they have fruit for birds. And I've been seeing insectivorous birds because I'm planting more and more native plants, and especially in the back, I have created a hedgerow of native shrubs, and birds that eat insects and berries are frequenting those shrubs. So we were so interested in the birds that had been visiting, we added a stream and pond to our yard, and it attracts a continuous array of interesting birds, especially during migration. And this is just a picture of a blue jay family that was visiting. Very pretty birds. And it's also been an outdoor classroom. It's really sparked our interest in learning about nature and in wanting to conserve nature. I had never spent much time in nature and hadn't been particularly interested in it, but now we really are. And for some more information, you can check my website, my blog, and I have a list of books and other websites here. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. We'll open up the floor to questions now.
Okay.
There are a few that came in. We'll start with this one here. There's some wildflowers can be quite invasive. And what plants should we stay away from if planting in a limited surface in our existing gardens? I think I'm also going to tie in another question, which is someone asked if they should remove a buckthorn bush before building pollinator garden.
So the term invasive is not applied to native plants. It's used exclusively for non-native plants that can spread out of control when they're in the wild, in wild spaces, and they crowd out native vegetation. So there are some native plants that spread aggressively through their root systems or seeds. Two that come to mind are Canada goldenrod and common milkweed. So you may not want to grow those in a small yard, but you can plant others. For the milkweed, you can plant butterfly milkweed, which is short and orange, or swamp milkweed, which is taller, maybe 3 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet tall, and it has pink flowers or sometimes white. For the goldenrods, you can, there are clumping varieties that you can use in a garden. For sun, Ohio goldenrod is my favorite. And for shade, blue stem goldenrod is a good choice. And the second question, you should, the answer to the second question, you should definitely remove the buckthorn. And if you can't get to it this spring, then at least cut the branches off that had flowers so that you don't end up with the fruit developing and producing the seed that will spread into more. There had been a buckthorn in my backyard. My neighbor had liked the shape, so she kept it. And it produced thousands of seedlings, I'm sure. I would pull them out by the handful. So it's just, you can see how it spreads completely out of control. And birds will eat the fruit and then they spread it elsewhere. Some good substitutes are for a smaller a shrub, maybe is 4 to 5 feet tall, is black chokeberry. It has white flowers and blueberries. And for something larger, pagoda dogwood is good for shade or part shade, either one. And a service berry is good for a sunnier spot. The berries start out, for service berry, the berries start out a red and then they turn blue when they're ripe.
Okay, and I'm going to go to the next question, which just came in, but it's I guess I wouldn't say urgent, but it refers to cutting stems down, whether it's important in the fall or spring. So the question is, you mentioned cutting stems down to 15 inches, for example, in the front yard where it needs to be tidier. Does it matter whether we do that in the fall or spring?
So if I leave the stems standing for the winter, because birds will eat the seeds on the seed heads, and I enjoy watching them and I want to provide another food source for them. But if you find those seed heads unsightly, you can cut them back to 15 inches in the fall. But I would leave the seed heads just lying on the ground. You could stick them at the back or even just on the ground where you cut them. Then the food is still there until there's a lot of snow. And you could cut them up into smaller pieces in the spring. Or you could even put the seed heads where you would like more of that plant so that some of the seeds will germinate and you'll have a patch of them there, perhaps. Whatever you do, there's just no need to put it into leaf bags and put it on the curb. The material will decompose and help improve the soil, the organic matter in the soil, and will act as mulch.
Excellent. On the reference of, you had mentioned saving, helping out monarchs or other species by collecting eggs. Someone asked, if you take an egg off of one plant outdoors, do you have to put it on the same type of plant?
So I'm not sure about the butterfly eggs. I mean, they would still need to be on a host plant for that butterfly. So you couldn't put a monarch egg on something other than milkweed. But I have heard that if it's a caterpillar already and eating, that you shouldn't switch it to another kind of variety of that plant. So for example, for the monarchs of milkweed, if it has started, the caterpillar has started eating common milkweed, it may not eat the swamp milkweed if you switched it to one of those.
Great, thank you.
We have a question here about collecting wild seeds. Transplanting native seeds from wild areas may not be advisable, but is collecting wild seeds okay?
Yes, it is, but there are a few conditions. If it's a rare plant or a small population of a plant, then you would only want to take a very small amount, like say 5% or 10%. But if several people do that, and you don't know who else might come after you, there might not be enough seed left to maintain that population of plant. So I would say if there's a lot of that plant, then it's fine. But you still can take a small amount. And then once you're growing a plant in your yard, then you can collect your own seed from that plant. And it can be difficult to identify what a plant is when it's in seed. Usually it's a brown stick and shriveled leaves, and it's hard to tell exactly what it is. So if you see something that you are interested in collecting seed for when it's in bloom, then you can mark it or remember where it was, and that will help you in identifying it or finding it later. And you may need permission when you're collecting seeds. If you do need permission if you're in a provincial park or an NCC land. Those are two places I can think of that you are supposed to have permission before you collect any seed. If you find a plant on the side of the road or in some, friend's farm or whatever, then I'm sure it's fine.
Great. Another question we have is, what is the risk of attracting pests with a pollinator garden?
Now, I'm not sure what kind of pests this question refers to. I'm assuming it's insect pests like aphids, but I'm not sure. So I will answer it assuming that it's insects. So there really aren't any risks. It's food for other insects. So once you attract, if you have these pest insects in your yard, they will draw in other insects that will eat them, or that their larvae will eat them. So you can help attract these predatory and parasitoid insects. They're sometimes called beneficial insects in your yard by planting flowers that they like. They will drink nectar. Some eat pollen as well. White and yellow flat flowers, like boneset and dill, they attract these beneficial insects. And if you see something like aphids on a plant, you don't need to panic. Just wait a little while, and it's likely that it will attract the right insect. But if it doesn't, if it's your garden is still small and you want to do something about it, you can try to control it manually. For example, you can squish aphids with your finger. You can spray them off with a jet of water from your hose. You can squish Japanese beetles. There are some kinds of insects that, especially invasive ones, that are more difficult to control, and you may have to take other measures. For example, in my garden, I have high bush cranberry viburnum shrubs, and they're highly susceptible to viburnum leaf beetle. And the best way to control these leaf beetles is to cut off the egg casings that they create on the tips of stems. And I did not do that. So each year the population increased, and this year they just completely defoliated my shrubs. So I cut back the shrubs in the fall to remove all the egg casings, and I put the ends with the egg casings in a garbage bag so they wouldn't hatch next year and spread again. And I'm hoping now, when the shrubs grow again, I can control the leaf beetles better. There's also a good book at the Ottawa Public Library called Attracting Beneficial Bugs that has a lot more tips on attracting the predatory and parasitoid insects to your yard.
Thank you, Barrett. There's a question here about hybridized or nativized wild plants. Many nurseries sell hybridized or nativized wild plants. Can some be good candidates for pollinator gardens, and which ones would you recommend?
Are there some nativars, that's the term for native plant cultivars, that are good candidates for a pollinator garden? I don't buy that many nativars. So there's only one that I can think of that I would like to include. That is a phlox, which isn't native to here. It was a naturally occurring variation called Gina. That's the variety. It's Jeana, and it is particularly attractive to butterflies. So if you want to learn more about native cultivars and see if there are any that you would want to choose, or when you're thinking of buying something, you can double check them. Search for Annie White cultivars, and Annie White is a researcher who has studied cultivars and how they are different from the straight species. So how much nectar they have, or pollen, or whatever. And also the Mount Cuba Center plant trials, search for that. and they have tested cultivars of different plants over several years. They plant them and monitor them and track things like insect visits to see how they compare. And perhaps some of them aren't as hardy or as robust, so they present all this information in tables when their trials are finished. That's how I found out about the Gina phlox. It was particularly attractive to butterflies. And another disadvantage of nativars is that even when they're naturally occurring variations, when they're identified, and the people want to sell them, they reproduce them using tissue culture. So they're clones, basically. So they don't have the variations that you would find in nature. So it's not contributing to the biodiversity of that plant. But again, in a garden, I'm sure a few are fine. And you can have a look at those, look up those places to find out more about it.
I think there's one more question here. And I think it was in reaction to putting your plants in the snow in January. And just a question of how tall are they now?
Well, they're not plants yet. They're still just seeds in pots in the snow. We haven't had enough warm weather for them to germinate yet. It hasn't been warm for long enough. So once we do have a longer stretch of warm weather, some will start to germinate, and some take longer before they will germinate, and then I'll have the plants. Nurseries typically use the artificial cold treatment for the seeds in the fridge, and they can plant them in their greenhouses or hoop houses earlier than the spring. The greenhouses are warmer, so the plants have a head start. So when you buy native plants from nurseries, they're a little more mature, and they will flower sooner.
All right, and that's all the questions we have. I'd like to thank you and Piero as well, and all the participants for coming out tonight. A reminder that you should receive an email tomorrow morning, or not tomorrow morning, sorry, around this time tomorrow, with a link to the recording if you want to view it again. And we're also going to post it on our website. That's hunt-club.ca/butterflyway, and that's one word. So we invite everyone to also follow our Hunt Club Community Association Facebook and Twitter. We're going to post more information down the road about the Butterflyway project and other things as well, as it's pretty active. So thanks again for coming out, and hope you all have a wonderful time creating pollinator gardens.
Good luck with your gardens. Bye.
Thank you very much.